like to welcome everyone to our annual Behaviour and Health Research Unit lecture, jointly organised with the Centre for Science and Policy. I'm Teresa Marteau. I'm the Director of the Behaviour and Health Research Unit, which is based in the Clinical School here at the University of Cambridge. And I'm just going to say a little bit about what we do in the Behaviour and Health Research Unit, say a tiny bit about what happens in the Centre for Science and Policy, before moving on to introduce our lecturer for this evening. So the Behaviour and Health Research Unit, you can read more about us in the pamphlet that was on the seats, which also tells you who is here this evening. So the focus of our research is generating evidence on effective ways of changing behaviour across populations. Our focus is particularly on cues in our physical environment that shape our behaviour, often without awareness. And many of the behaviours, or most of the behaviours that we're studying, are those in which you're going to be engaging in the next 90 minutes. So that's excess of sedentary behaviour. There will be some consumption of alcohol and possibly even some food, hopefully not too much to excess. But the one behaviour in which I doubt too many of you will be engaging in is consumption of tobacco. As I say, you can read more about our work in the leaflet. As I mentioned, this lecture is organised in conjunction with the Centre for Science and Policy, and as you can see, if you can see across the bottom, very important players in this space, in that what Centre for Science and Policy do here in Cambridge is they link research with policy. And there's a little bit about the unit, the centre in the leaflet, and I'm delighted that, amongst others, the director, Rob Doubleday, is here with us this evening. So the topic of tonight's talk, e-cigarettes in the context of tobacco control policies, couldn't be a better fit, really, for the interest both of the Behaviour and Health Research Unit and the Centre for Science and Policy. So not only the topic, but also our speaker, who actually is a one-person bridge in terms of generating research as well as being able to apply that to policy. And you'll hear more about that as I tell you about our speaker this evening. And I'm particularly delighted to accept Linda when you hear about at least 6 posts that she holds currently. It's amazing that we managed to get her to find time in her diary to talk to us this evening. So correct me if I'm wrong, Linda, but what I have you down as is Professor of Health Policy at the University of Stirling, Director of the Institute for Social Marketing, also at the University of Stirling, Dean of Research at the University of Stirling, Deputy Director of the UK Centre for Tobacco and Alcohol Studies, and for the last 2 years she's combined these 4 roles with a secondment to Cancer Research UK's Cancer Prevention Champion. And as part of that, she holds the Cancer Research UK Bupa Chair in Behavioural Research for Cancer Prevention, all in one person. Fantastic. So Linda's first degree was in politics at the University of Toronto, and her second degree, her PhD, was in social policy at the University of Edinburgh. And her research has primarily focused on evaluation of public health, population-level interventions, focused on drugs and alcohol, but actually alcohol's a drug as well, but anyway, drugs and alcohol, you get the gist, and inequalities in health. But her particular contribution, where she has made a significant contribution, is in tobacco control, policy evaluation of those, and smoking cessation interventions. As well as highly regarded research, she's made other key contributions, and I just want to pick out a few of them. So she's been involved in developing 7 different sets of NICE guidelines on smoking cessation and tobacco control. Any of you who've been involved in just one, I think, God, 7. She authored the UK's government review of smoke-free legislation, which was published in 2011, and also led on the development of an independent alcohol strategy for the UK called Health First, which was published in 2014, and extraordinarily enough was endorsed by over 70 organisations. You'll be pleased to know that Linda does advise the UK government, also the EU and US governments, particularly on tobacco harm reduction, e-cigarettes, and alternative nicotine delivery devices. So I don't doubt that what you're going to hear this evening either has formed part of that advice or will form part of that advice. So e-cigarettes, as I would imagine that most of you will know, they have been described as one of the most divisive technologies to hit public health, indeed medicine, in recent years. With some people seeing them as a threat to the ground that's already been made in terms of tobacco control, others seeing them as a great opportunity to make yet further grounds in terms of controlling tobacco. Others seeing it as both, others thinking that maybe it's a complete distraction. So Linda, we very much look forward to hearing from you to help us see a broad array of evidence to make up our own minds. So let us hear about electronic cigarettes, a disruptive technology. Linda, very welcome.
Lovely introduction. Thank you so much, Teresa, and thank you for the invitation. It's lovely to see some familiar faces in the audience as well, and I'm very grateful to the Behaviour and Health Research Unit and the Centre for Science and Policy for inviting me tonight. I'm going to say a couple of words to start off, just in terms of where we are at the moment, and then I'll give you an outline of what I'm going to cover for the next 40 minutes or so on this really rather tricky topic and very contemporary issue. Just to take a step back, we're sitting here in Cambridge tonight, and many of you who do research on this issue and others know that how we behave is very context specific. We all live in different environments and we're influenced by those. And just this week in India, we have a case of a retailer who's been jailed, and certainly that's the decision the court has taken, for 3 years because in the particular state in India where he is working, alternative nicotine delivery devices are illegal. They can't be sold. So he's going to be imprisoned because he's chosen to make these products available. That's a decision in Punjab, and you can see here a comment from the Health Secretary on this issue. And if we just take a step back, we know that India has, for many years, had high levels of tobacco consumption, different forms of tobacco often from what we use in the UK. But we have just under 1 million Indians who die prematurely from tobacco use each year. And then in contrast, this is a summary, I suppose, of where I think we are now in the UK on electronic cigarettes. As Teresa has said, it's hotly debated, but we do have some consensus. And just last year in September, following the publication of a report by Public Health England that I'll touch on later, the UK public health community issued a joint statement. And what these organisations said, Cancer Research UK and many others, was that all the evidence suggests that e-cigarettes are significantly less harmful than smoking, and current smokers should not be discouraged from using them. So in an international context, you can actually argue that we are quite different from many other countries. And I'm going to reflect on that through the talk. But just to give you my declarations of interest, which are very important in this field as they are in others, for you to read. And this is what I'm going to touch on. It is a bit of a story, actually, that I'd like to tell about this issue. I perhaps have more time this evening than we often do to cover this. And so I'm going to take you through talking about tobacco and nicotine. Many of you in the audience are working in this area and so familiar with this evidence, but some won't be. Then explain what is tobacco harm reduction, which I see as the foundation for our approach to electronic cigarettes. Touch on the evidence reviews for PHE, and then give you an overview on where we are now with smoking in the United Kingdom, and also who's using cigarettes for children and for adults. I'll touch a little bit on safety and harm perception. Safety in itself could be a whole talk, in isolation, but I'll give you some key points on that. And then also importantly, say something about the marketing of these products, which has caused a lot of concern, not just in the UK, but elsewhere. And then crucially, what do we know about if somebody uses an electronic cigarette, a nicotine delivery device, what do they do for smoking cessation? And in conclusion, of course, we are on the cusp of a very big policy change that's about to happen next month. The Tobacco Products Directive from the EU will be introduced, and I'll tell you a bit about that. And then also in conclusion, just highlight the importance of continuing research in this area and how I think many of us could work together to expand that. So it's worth reflecting on the UK's relationship with tobacco, which goes back over many centuries. And we had some of the highest tobacco use rates in the world in the 1950s, for example, where above 80% of men between the ages of 35 and 59 were smokers. And when I talk to my colleagues in Australia, in Canada and other places, and they point to the fantastic progress they've made in tobacco control and reducing smoking rates, and they have, but they had nowhere near as high smoking rates as we did. Not so much amongst women, but particularly amongst men. And you see the rate those have dropped in successive years and the gains that have been made. But we still have, in the UK overall, around 1 in 5 adults that uses tobacco. As many of you will know, on average they lose 10 years of life, and up to 2/3 of smokers will die prematurely from tobacco use. And it still is the leading preventable cause of death. So it's a priority in terms of supporting people who choose to stop smoking and to be able to do so. But of course, there's lots of reasons why people smoke, but the main reason is nicotine. And this slide here, on this side, this is a chart from my colleague Marcus Monaco at the University of Bristol. This is a person throughout the day. So basically they're waking up in the morning, 8 o'clock, that's quite late, and they have their first cigarette. They're having it within 5 minutes of waking, which is one of our main markers of nicotine dependence. You see plasma nicotine levels go up, and then they very quickly drop, and they crave another cigarette, and so they go up and down and up and down. And then this dip here is the person's asleep. Some of the people we work with in our trials wake up in the middle of the night to have a cigarette because they are very nicotine dependent. Then the person wakes up again and it starts again. And on this side, we just have a comparison between the tobacco-specific nitrosamines, which are carcinogenic in tobacco, and then how much of the constituents of tobacco somebody takes in. And these are based on whether it has low nicotine content in the cigarette or whether there's higher nicotine content. And what you can see here is the person who's smoking a low nicotine content cigarette will actually take deeper draws. They'll smoke more of the cigarette to get the nicotine that they need to keep those peaks to stave off the withdrawal. But at the same time, they're exposed, irrespective of nicotine content, roughly to the same level of toxins, what's in the tar in cigarettes. And that actually is part of the reason why cutting down smoking on its own without using another nicotine-containing device, we don't promote that widely, because on its own people tend to smoke the remaining cigarettes harder and they're exposed to more toxins than they would be if they're just getting their nicotine from the normal number of cigarettes, or they're not benefiting, their health isn't benefiting. So people smoke for the nicotine, and then of course we have been very successful, unfortunately, in the past in some of our clumsier, earlier health promotion campaigns in equating nicotine with tobacco. We talk about the two as if they're the same. And this is what happens as a result in the population. This is from the International Tobacco Control Survey, now operating in 22 countries. A few years old, people were asked, does nicotine cause cancer? And you can see amongst respondents in these 4 English-speaking countries, pretty significant number of people thought that it did cause cancer. And then amongst lower income respondents, they were more likely to say so. And pretty worryingly, actually, a lot of people thought that nicotine replacement therapy would harm health. So we've equated nicotine with tobacco, and many people think it's harmful. And 2 years ago, I did a survey of our Stop Smoking Service advisors who are working with smokers regularly, and some of them still thought that nicotine caused cancer. So we have a problem with nicotine, and I think the problem with nicotine has contributed to some of the debate about electronic cigarettes, and I'll come on to that. So in relation to nicotine and tobacco, 2/3 of smokers in the UK initiate tobacco use before they're 18. Interestingly, the age of smoking uptake now in the UK has been gradually rising, and I'll talk about youth smoking in a moment. But most people start when they're children. They start for a range of reasons, but they primarily keep smoking because of nicotine dependence. It's often described as an adult choice, but it's not an adult choice if you're not an adult when you start smoking, and then you become nicotine dependent and you keep smoking. And it's Professor Michael Russell, who trained many of the leading colleagues in the field who are still active now, said smokers smoke for the nicotine but die from the tar. And he was one of the early pioneers of nicotine replacement therapy. And I think here in the UK, we have a tradition of trying, in our services anyway, to separate nicotine from tobacco, recognizing that nicotine is addictive, but it's the many other harmful constituents in tobacco that kill. Now, we still have a long way to go on that, but actually we've tried to separate that, draw that distinction more than in many other countries, like the US, for example, but there are others as well. And this just gives you an example of how we've tried to have people understand and accept that it's not necessarily the nicotine that's harmful, but actually they may need to use nicotine if they want to stop smoking. Just bear with me a second. And this is just a picture of my three colleagues. Some of you will recognize them. Robert West, Anne McNeil, and Martin Law, who wrote some guidance in the journal Thorax in the year 1998 originally on how smokers who wanted to stop could be offered NRT and also behavioural support to quit. And on the basis of that, and in fact earlier research, in 1997, that's when it was developed and published in 1998, the new Labour government produced a white paper called Smoking Kills. And Smoking Kills actually was based on the contents of the Royal College of Physicians report, Smoking and Health in 1962. It laid out the same policies that had been recommended there and introduced more comprehensive tobacco control for the UK. And importantly, it made a commitment to introducing stop smoking services. The first country in the world to offer free at the point of use support for smokers who want to quit in most locations without having to pay for it, as I said. They were piloted for 1 year in deprived areas, and actually this is how I got into the field. I did a very early study when they were set up. They were then rolled out from the year 2000, and they were initially able to offer behavioural support and subsidised nicotine replacement therapy, and then NRT free on prescription. And then we had other medications, bupropion, and then varenicline and Champix available from 2007. And now they exist across the country, although they're facing some challenges, and they provide free NRT, and that includes to pregnant women. So if we were so worried about nicotine by itself, we wouldn't be routinely giving it to pregnant women who smoke, and we do. Maybe come back to that. And this just shows you, I'll move on from the services in a moment, but they are an important context. This is from 2002 to 2014. The number of people who set a quit date, who chose to access these services and try and stop, over 800,000 a year at its peak. And these are just the short-term quit rates at 4 weeks. So national services free at the point of use, providing nicotine-containing products, encouraging people to stop. And you could argue that that approach to free nicotine, if you will, and behavioural support resulted in some differences between us and other countries. And this again is from the ITC, the 4 English-speaking countries. You can see that if you live in the US, in this particular survey, you were more likely to have your doctor or others say you really should stop smoking. But in contrast, in the UK, our smokers were more likely to have received specialist help to stop, and also to have stopped in the short term. And that may be a marker of some of the impact of the services. So we've got this free at the point of use support. We've talked about why nicotine might have a role to play in cessation. So what else? How do we move from that to harm reduction? So by 2006, you remember that's an important year, the smoke-free laws came in then, our smoking rates in the UK were continuing to fall, the service uptake was good, there were other policies that had been introduced, but there was something else missing, and the thing that was missing, and to some extent this still exists, is actually we had failed to do much, if anything, for some groups of adult smokers whose smoking rates really had not declined much at all in the more deprived communities, people with long-standing mental health conditions, and others. And the RCP produced a report on tobacco harm reduction. And then this was followed by national guidance on tobacco harm reduction from NICE, as Teresa mentioned earlier. Our committee met for 2 years. We produced guidance for the NHS and others. And we still are the only country in the world that has a formal national policy on tobacco harm reduction. So what is that? Okay, so I imagine some of you maybe do research on sexual health, on drug misuse, etc. So we're all familiar potentially with the concept of harm reduction. But it's actually relatively unusual in tobacco control. Where we have a history, for good or for bad, or sort of all or nothing. You know, you must stop smoking, and there isn't really an alternative, just get away from tobacco. So the guidance says stopping smoking is a priority, and the best thing is to set a quit date and stick to it. But many people find it difficult. They find it very difficult, very difficult. And so cutting down is a valid approach, and a lot of smokers will cut down, and they cut down regularly. If you look at the surveys, around 1 in 3 smokers in every year will make a quit attempt, but about 60 to 70% say they're cutting down at some point in that year. So it's far more frequent. But when combined with nicotine-containing products like NRT, it looks promising. And the main reason it looks promising is a couple of reasons. It can lead towards cessation in the longer term, even for people who don't intend to quit if they use NRT and smoke. It can be used for temporary abstinence, and here we were particularly interested in people who were in hospital, in forensic units, in other places where they couldn't smoke. And more crucially, the guidance says that long-term nicotine use, even after cessation, even for years, is far safer than smoking. So I often use the example of my uncle who stopped smoking 15 years ago and still uses the NRT lozenges every day. That's just something that he finds helpful. And he still, doesn't want to go back to cigarettes. That's his choice. But that's controversial, isn't it? Because it kind of says, it's okay, addiction's okay to something. And it also says, it's okay to spend money on that. And it potentially even says that we should take some of that money from the public purse, if the alternative is somebody going back to tobacco. So you can see why this guidance was tricky in a number of respects. And in fact, the implementation of it has been very tricky. Right, now moving on, you're probably wondering when you should start talking about e-cigarette. So we're getting there. So when we developed the NICE guidance, e-cigarettes were just emerging. In fact, I was with John Britton and Anne McNeil yesterday, and they were reminding me that when the RCP report was produced in 2007, the week that it was published, we had the first sample of the Royan e-cigarette from China that a colleague had, and we were all having a look at it. When the guidance was produced a bit later, they were starting to be used. We used the term nicotine-containing products because we knew they might act like NRT, they could become licensed. Then their use really escalated. None of them were licensed. A lot of us thought we need medicinal regulation, we'll go down this route, we'll have light-touch regulation, we'll have licensed e-cigarettes, people can use them, they'll be free, it'll be great. Didn't happen. And the guidance was quickly outdated, and it is outdated. And new evidence reviews and recommendations were urgently needed. So our centre that Teresa mentioned, which is one of the UK CRC centres, I know Martin White is here, was previously Director of FUSE in the North East, and other colleagues work with these centres. We produced 3 reports for PHE, and the most recent one is the one that caused most controversy published last year, which was a pretty comprehensive review of the evidence. So what's happening with e-cigarettes now? This is the prevalence of electronic cigarette use among smokers and recent ex-smokers from Robert West's Smoking Toolkit study. And the use of e-cigarettes is still continuing to grow. It's around 18% who are using e-cigarettes among smokers and recent ex-smokers who stopped smoking in the last year. And you can see that daily use is less frequent than any use of e-cigarettes. We have about 2.6 million vapers, people who use e-cigarettes in the UK. We have higher rates of electronic cigarette use than most countries, primarily because so far we've adopted a fairly liberal approach to the availability and regulation of these products, which of course is changing. And this is just from my own country, from Scotland. This is our routine health survey. Around 5% of adults currently using e-cigarettes, with 10% previously having used them. And importantly, in the last Scottish Health Survey, in the Smoking Toolkit, in all the other surveys, there is almost no use, regular use of e-cigarettes in never smoking adults or long-term ex-smoking adults. There's a group of never smoking adults in the population who use nicotine replacement therapy, interestingly. Don't know if any of you who've never smoked use NRT or have tried it. It's quite unusual. But there are some never smokers who are using e-cigarettes, but they are very, very small in number, tiny, less than 0.5%. So what we're seeing is that e-cigarettes are used by adults who smoke or people who've relatively recently stopped smoking. That's who's using them in the UK. And I'll talk about teenagers later. But this is the most interesting slide. So these are what people use to stop smoking in their past quit attempt, again from the toolkit. The blue line is our stop smoking services. You can see a very small proportion of smokers using these. It's been that way. Traditionally we've only reached about 5 to 7%, and we've gone down recently. And then you can see the other medications that we provide, Champix, etc. And then look at the e-cigarettes. So e-cigarettes are used in over 1/3 of quit attempts in the UK now. They're the most popular approach to stopping smoking. That's what people are choosing to use. It's their choice. But then in terms of nicotine products generally, a lot of people say, well, doesn't that mean we're just using more nicotine? And that's really worrying because it's a dependence-forming product. Well, what you'll see is actually nicotine replacement therapy. The use of that has gone down by quite a lot, and e-cigarettes have gone up. So in terms of all nicotine use, we're not seeing a significant rise in terms of all nicotine use. In fact, it's gone down slightly in the last year or so. So what's happening to smoking? This is the most important thing. We could debate the pros and cons of these devices, and we will do. But the priority for me, anyway, is what's happening with tobacco use in the population. What does that mean for families and the NHS and the other people and organisations that are affected by tobacco? And smoking prevalence is going down. It's been going down consistently over the last few years. And in fact, arguably, we had a greater reduction in a few years when e-cigarettes were starting really to be used than we had seen in previous years. And interestingly, the success in stopping smoking, that rate as measured by the smoking toolkit, has increased since 2011. So there isn't actually any evidence that as e-cigarette use has gone up, it has in some way hampered our ability to continue to push down smoking rates. This is in adults. We're not seeing that happening in the population through this type of surveillance. And this is the nicotine and cigarette market. And again, overall, you'll see the cigarette market is going down as tobacco consumption is going down. Of course, it's going up in many countries in the developing world, but that's another story. But actually, nicotine use is going down as well. So we're not replacing cigarettes with e-cigarettes and widespread nicotine use. They're being primarily used by people to stop smoking or to cut down smoking. Some of them may take a long time to cut down their smoking or stop smoking with e-cigarettes, and some may continue to use e-cigarettes for some time. But we're not seeing an explosion in the nicotine market. So what about use by children? These are actually my own children. They are a couple of years older now, and certainly my son's not looking as he's now in those teenage years. So, we were actually making a film for another piece of work that was totally unrelated to e-cigarettes at the time, and that's why this photograph was taken. But I hadn't realised, it was only after we had the image that, of course, the e-cigarettes were on the counter, and lots of people say to me, well, you know, they've replaced the lottery tickets. They're right on the counter with the sweets. And that's right, they are on the counter with the sweets, and particularly in this picture. So what is happening in terms of teenagers? And people are really concerned about this. And many of our colleagues overseas feel that e-cigarette use amongst children has escalated rapidly, and that we should be really concerned about this because it's a new addictive product introduced into the population. Well, this is what's happening in the UK. These are the UK youth surveys. We did a very short article in a journal that just brought together 4 surveys, very basic, that had been done in the year 2014, roughly in the same 12-month period, but you can see the age groups are different. This is our survey that we do for Cancer Research UK. This is UK-wide. This is a Great Britain survey. This is a large school-based survey in Wales, and this is the government survey in Scotland with 13 to 15-year-olds. And you can see ever use, so ever experimenting with the e-cigarette was pretty consistent between these surveys. It was about 12% in 3 of the surveys, and slightly lower in 1 of them. And then for all these young people, teenagers, regular use was actually quite low. It was about 2% in the UK survey, for example. But for me, the crucial bit is here. What's happening with the kids who've never smoked a cigarette, ever smoked a cigarette? Ever use amongst never smokers, so that's experimentation, you can see those rates there. One of the surveys is about 5%. So 5% of never smoking teenagers who tried an e-cigarette. And in fact, in more recent data that we have, and also from the US, those experimentation rates are significantly higher. So we're seeing a lot of experimentation or ever use of e-cigarettes amongst children in the UK and elsewhere. That's definitely happening. But the regular use by never smokers is low. And what makes me very concerned is that some of the publications we see emerging do not differentiate between ever use, recent use, and regular use. And don't tell you whether the never smoking children are regularly using them. In most of the surveys, there were no never smoking children who regularly used an e-cigarette. In the Welsh survey, there were about 52 out of their large sample of about 6,000 who were regularly using. And another article that was published from some of my colleagues in Stirling very recently, they had a sample of 4,000 teenagers, and of those 4,000, 6 who were never smokers were regularly vaping. Now that doesn't mean that won't change. Our data from Scandinavia, where they have snus and oral tobacco use, and they've had it for some time, there is a group of never cigarette smoking teenagers who start to use snus and continue to use it. So I think these figures will change, but this is where we are at the moment. And that is in the context of, at the same time, our youth tobacco use rates are continuing to decline consistently. So this is just one example. Celsius in Scotland, you can see amongst 15-year-olds, the girls have still slightly higher rate of smoking than the boys, but then when you get down to the 13-year-olds, it's really only 2% who are smoking. So our youth tobacco use rates are very low now. Now, if e-cigarettes were a gateway to tobacco, this picture would change. It's not. Not yet. But I don't see any evidence that e-cigarettes are driving young people towards cigarette smoking. And I'm sure others might want to discuss that. So why do we read the American headlines and the others and say there's this huge explosion in e-cigarette use in teenagers, we're creating a new generation of addicts and we might be creating new smokers? Well, one of the reasons is the questions they ask. And this, as a researcher, is of interest to me. And I think we're moving towards improving this. So poor questions on e-cigarettes, because basically we didn't know what we were doing. We had these new devices, they looked like cigarettes. We thought we just asked the same questions as we asked smokers, and then we discovered actually those were the wrong questions. And unfortunately, some of us are still asking these questions. Have you ever used an e-cigarette? That's like, have you ever tried a cigarette, even a puff? That's an important question for us in tobacco control. We then classify them as a user, particularly if they're a young user. Have you used one in the past 30 days? The Americans do a lot of this. That means you're a current user. You might have just used it once in the last 30 days, but you're still a current user. But here, in terms of how we classify a smoker and a current smoker, particularly for adults, we classify them as somebody who smokes daily. But when you look at the studies of e-cigarettes, we often classify people as current e-cigarette users when they're not using an e-cigarette daily. So these are better questions. I won't go into a lot of detail, but we're about to produce a paper with our American colleagues that set out what we think are some of the key questions to ask. Now, frequency of use, distinguishing experimentation and regular use is key. And in a moment, I'm going to go on to the types of devices and talk about what we should ask on that. Because one of the big challenges for e-cigarette research is this is not a single product. It's multiple products with lots of variations that make it actually very difficult or challenging to study. So what about safety? People are really interested in this. It's important. We need to understand, are these devices safe? Well, they're probably not safe, actually, but how do we define safety? So safe means less harmful, or safer means less harmful. And in discussions of safety, it's important to distinguish between relative and absolute harm. And amongst smokers, the comparator should always be tobacco. Amongst never smokers, you can talk more about absolute risk because they're exposing themselves to something in the absolute. So just to summarize, there is a vast literature now on the safety of electronic cigarettes. In contrast to reduced risk cigarettes, some of you will be familiar with that. The tobacco industry in the past has, and is still in fact, trying to produce products that contain tobacco and are combustible but are regarded as less risky. But e-cigarettes are not combustible, and it's the combustion that causes a lot of the harm from tobacco. In contrast to smokeless tobacco products like pan or snus, e-cigarettes are not tobacco products. They contain nicotine and flavorings, which can be toxicants, and there are toxicants in e-cigarettes, but they're present at much lower levels than in tobacco. And my colleague Maciej Gonowicz and others have produced papers which say, depending on what you look at, whether it be a metal, aldehydes, whatever the constituent is, it's between 9 to 400 times lower in an e-cigarette and the e-liquids than it is present in tobacco. So it's there, but it's at far lower levels. And all the evidence suggests they're safer than tobacco cigarettes. And just to flag up, on the 29th of April, we are publishing through the Royal College of Physicians the revised tobacco harm reduction report, a comprehensive review again, and it will provide the evidence we have on all the safety data in detail, but these statements are consistent with that report. And this slide, of course, is a study that caused a lot of the controversy from the Public Health England report because it was the source of the figure e-cigarettes are 95% less harmful than tobacco. And this was an expert view using a well-established method where they brought people together and based on existing research evidence, they tried to compare different nicotine products and what the relative harms were. From the very harmful products to the non-combustible, which has much less harm, to no use at all, which has no harm. And you can just see the comparisons here. And the subsequent studies that have been done, individual studies on toxicants, etc., this is not a million miles off the mark. We can debate whether it's 80%, 98%, but all the data we have so far suggests that they're less harmful. What we don't have is long-term data on long-term use. Inhalation of the constituents of e-cigarettes deep into the lungs. We will expect to see health harms from the use of these products. But they will be, we believe, at far lower level than what we've seen from the harms of tobacco. But the problem is that the public don't believe that. And that's a problem for tobacco harm reduction. This is one example. There are several of just simple cohort surveys. This one published by my colleagues from King's College London. And this asks adults whether they believed that e-cigarettes were less harmful, equally harmful, more harmful, or didn't know in relation to harms. And you can see that between the years, harm perceptions have gone up, which is problematic. And also harm perceptions amongst youth have continued to rise as well. So young people and adults tend to view e-cigarettes, some of them anyway, as equally harmful. You can see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to be a little bit quicker. I'm just going to touch on marketing. This is some example potentially of helpful e-cigarette marketing because it's talking about moving away from tobacco. It could be argued that this e-cigarette marketing is maybe not as helpful, depending on your view. But it's all disappearing soon, so actually we don't need to worry so much about that. And we'll talk about it later. But just very briefly, we don't have a lot of time to do, so I apologise, because this is the fantastic work that's been done here at Cambridge. Mickey is here, who's led on a number of these studies, looking at work where they've surveyed young people's response to e-cigarette adverts. First of all, does it affect the appeal of tobacco smoking in children? And these are the key findings from the first study. So exposure to adverts for e-cigarettes didn't seem to increase the appeal of tobacco smoking, but flavoured compared with non-flavoured e-cigarettes were regarded as more appealing, and they did elicit more interest in buying and trying e-cigarettes in this particular survey. And in the second survey, which I understand is in press and not out yet, but will be published very soon, they were looking at the type of ads. Were they glamorous or did they have health messages? And when children were exposed to those adverts, they didn't increase the appeal of smoking tobacco. So that's really positive. Children not enhanced interest in tobacco use through e-cigarette adverts. But they did lower the perceived harms of smoking 1 or 2 tobacco cigarettes. So seeing those adverts maybe made them regard that trying smoking wasn't so problematic. So is it possible that this type of marketing may reduce children's perceived harm of tobacco smoking? And I think that's a really important question to ask. And it's why people are concerned about the marketing. On smoking cessation, just briefly, we have 2 randomized control trials, which are now really out of date because they're looking at products that are no longer available. But in summary, they showed that e-cigarettes were about as effective for smoking cessation as the nicotine replacement therapy patch. We have other trials that are ongoing and some important work in the UK led by Peter Hayek and colleague. And these are promising studies just showing promising evidence for smoking cessation. And just to highlight one study in particular from, again, colleagues at UCL, who surveyed the population looking at toolkit data and showed that people who'd used an e-cigarette in terms of short-term cessation were around 50 to 60% more likely to stop smoking than those who just used willpower on their own or used nicotine replacement therapy that they bought over the counter. But the e-cigarette users were less likely to be successful than those that went to a stop smoking service, or used varenicline and received behavioural support. So the data so far is about mid-range on cessation. There's some really poor studies out there, but when you look at the better ones, there's definitely promise for smoking cessation, but not a huge amount of evidence. And there's a lot of variability in the studies. And one of the reasons for that is what people use. So I haven't shown you images of the different types of e-cigarettes, but this is a Cigalite. These are refillable Cigalites. They look like cigarettes. These are second generations tanks. They have you can put the e-liquid in the e-cigarette. It's refillable. And then we also have third generation e-cigarettes, which look, many of them, like boxes that look nothing like cigarettes. Most people start with the Cigalite and then they move to the tanks. So in regular e-cigarette users, most of them are not using Cigalites, with some exceptions. And this is the reason, is nicotine delivery. The Cigalites are actually pretty poor at delivering nicotine, but the later generation e-cigarettes are much better. And so if nicotine helps people with smoking cessation, you want them to use things that are effective. And what you can see here, just briefly, without going into all the detail, is that in one study, which followed up people who were using different types of e-cigarettes, either daily or not daily, the people who used the tank devices daily were more likely to stop smoking. Now that's not a surprise to me, because people who are nicotine dependent and get combination nicotine replacement therapy, 2 products, they're more likely to stop. So we need to make sure that people get the right dose for them. And then what about dual use? This is people who are ex-smokers, or they're dual users of e-cigarettes and smoking, and people are very concerned about the fact that the 2 products are being used together. And many people are using them together, but you'll see between 2014 and 2015, the proportion of dual users actually declined in contrast to ex-smokers. And I think this means that many people who use an e-cigarette who want to stop smoking, and not all of them want to stop smoking, but those who do, it takes actually quite a long time for them to move away from tobacco. And there's a period of dual use in that. I'm not going to go through all of this. I've got a couple of copies of this with me. It's just practical guidance for health professionals on what you can say to smokers about e-cigarettes, positive messages, and the bottom line is that people who want to access our smoking cessation services can do so if they're using an e-cigarette, and they can continue to provide help and support on that. So just for the last couple of minutes, I want to touch on the policy changes that are happening now. There's a huge international debate around these products. As I showed on the first slide, more than 50 countries have banned them already. And we had a big debate in the European Union about what was the right type of regulation. But for better or worse, we have a new tobacco products directive. And it really does 2 things. It allows products to be licensed as medicines or continue as consumer products. If they continue as consumer products, they have to go through a notification process to talk about, or to show what's in the e-cigarettes, how they will be labelled, constituents, etc. It places requirements on products, so they have to have child-proof caps on the e-liquid, and they need to be leak-proof, which is important. They also will only be able to provide the e-liquids in 10 milliliter containers. We can debate whether that was necessary or not. And the cost of notifying products is pretty low for those who produce them. And you will not be able to see this slide at all, and I apologize for that. But the TPD is fairly complicated, and this just summarizes what's happening with the changes. The key thing to emphasize is almost all forms of e-cigarette marketing will go, and many of them will go immediately. There will be no television advertising, no radio advertising, so broadcast media will go. In terms of print advertising, they won't be able to advertise in newspapers or magazines. Billboards will still be allowed, but not in Scotland, which I'll talk about in a moment. So we're going to see a real restriction on marketing. The packaging, there will need to be a health warning. Age of sale, we already have in place. There will be standards that the devices will need to reach if they're consumer products. And they will also, importantly, only be able to contain 20 milligrams per milliliter of nicotine in the e-liquids, which has been hotly contested because that's a lower nicotine concentration and may not be helpful for heavily nicotine-dependent adults. And the other route, of course, is that they can become medicines. And we do have one licensed product that I will talk about very briefly. This is the Scottish legislation. In Scotland, they've gone beyond the TPD, and we've introduced age of sale. There's a ban on adults buying them for children. We're enforcing a retail register, and all the remaining forms of domestic advertising except at the point of sale, will be banned in Scotland. So very significant changes there. So what about the licensed product, just to conclude for the last minute or two? You've got a medicinal licensing route, and we had hoped that we would have companies who would come forward to the MHRA with e-cigarettes that could be prescribed as medicines. So far we only have one. And this is the device. It's not on the market yet to be prescribed, but it does have its license. It's produced by British American Tobacco. There's 15 milligrams of nicotine per cartridge. This is just tells you what the patient information sheet says and also the findings from the studies that have been done. It's a much slower nicotine delivery than a tank. It's a low dose. It looks like a cigarette. It's produced by a tobacco company. It could be prescribed on the NHS. We'll see what colleagues decide about that when it does become available. I believe there will be other products that will come through after May, but we haven't seen any yet. And then in conclusion, for me anyway, this is a rapidly changing area. I edit a journal with colleagues called Nicotine and Tobacco Research. Most of the articles we receive now are on e-cigarettes. That wasn't the case 3 or 4 years ago. The evidence is growing at a very rapid rate. So one of the things we've done at Cancer Research UK, and Vicky and others have attended our meetings, we formed a national forum to keep people up to date, and we provided an evidence briefing on the latest studies. So if you're interested in the forum or the evidence briefing, please let me know. I'd be very happy and very pleased if others would access it. So just to conclude, I think our approach to e-cigarettes needs to be understood in the context of our histories and policies. Use is very prevalent in the UK, but it's confined to current and ex-smokers, and that's also the case largely in relation to teenagers. These devices are far safer than tobacco, but they are not risk-free. But a growing proportion of the public don't believe that. There's growing evidence of effectiveness for smoking cessation, but we need more well-conducted studies. And that's guiding how we communicate to health professionals and others on e-cigarettes. This year we're going to see a big change in the market in terms of how they're introduced and how they're allowed to be sold. And as I say, the evidence is growing all the time. And we need to keep tracking that. And I think we need to do better quality research on e-cigarettes so we can communicate effectively to the public, particularly to smokers, about these devices so that they contribute to the health gains we've had from smoking cessation. And not just now, but in the future. Thank you very much.